Avoidants associate emotional closeness with a loss of independence. So when a relationship becomes too predictable, too available, too accommodating, it stops feeling exciting and starts feeling suffocating. Not in a dramatic, conscious way, but in a subtle internal shift. Their nervous system begins to register safety as stagnation. And when that happens, their instinct is to pull away, not lean in. This is where most people make the critical mistake. They interpret that distance as a signal to give more, to become softer, quieter, easier to be with. But what they're actually doing is removing the very tension that keeps an avoidant engaged, because attraction at its core isn't built on comfort alone. It's built on polarity, on contrast, on a sense that there's something here that challenges you to show up differently. Think about it. Anything in life that fully submits to you loses its edge. It becomes background noise. But something that pushes back, that makes you think, that doesn't just fall in line, that's what captures attention. That's what creates emotional investment. And this is exactly what happens when you begin to challenge an avoidant in a grounded, self-respecting way. Now, when I say challenge, I don't mean confrontation for the sake of conflict. I'm talking about a calm, centered refusal to disappear just to keep the peace. It's the ability to say, I see what you're doing, and I'm not going to adjust myself to make it easier for you to avoid this. That kind of energy disrupts their pay-or-evade, yara-che, and yara-ye patterns. It forces them out of autopilot. Because here's the truth, avoidants are used to people accommodating them. They expect others to bend, to wait, to tolerate the distance. So when you hold your ground without becoming emotional or reactive, you create something unfamiliar. And unfamiliarity, when it's grounded in strength, creates curiosity. Suddenly, they're not just coasting through the connection anymore. They're thinking about it. They're questioning it. They're engaging with it on a deeper level. And that engagement is the beginning of real attraction, not surface level interest, but psychological investment. This is something Tony Robbins often emphasizes in a different way. People are not driven by comfort alone, they are driven by growth, by challenge, by the need to expand beyond who they currently are. And when you remove challenge from a relationship, you remove the very mechanism that creates growth. So when you challenge an avoidant, you're not pushing them away, you're giving the relationship a pulse again. You're reintroducing a sense of movement, of unpredictability, of depth. You're showing them that this connection isn't something they can take for granted or passively drift through. But here's the key. It only works if it comes from a place of certainty within yourself. If the challenge is rooted in fear or a need for validation, they'll withdraw. But if it comes from clarity, from self-respect, from knowing your value without needing them to confirm it, then it becomes magnetic. Because now, you're not chasing their attention, you're commanding their awareness. And that changes everything. So instead of asking, how can I make this easier so they stay? Ask yourself, where have I made this so comfortable that they stop showing up? Because the moment you reintroduce challenge with intention, you don't just get their attention, you awaken their engagement. And the truth is simple. Comfort might keep someone around temporarily, but it's challenge that makes them truly see you. Now, once you begin to understand that comfort alone won't sustain attraction, the next layer becomes even more critical, and that is the role of boundaries. Because challenging an avoidant without boundaries is just noise. It's inconsistent. It lacks weight. But when challenge is anchored in clear, self-respecting limits, something shifts at a much deeper level. You stop trying to be chosen and you start demonstrating that you are already choosing yourself. And this is where respect enters the dynamic. Avoidants, more than most, are highly sensitive to power dynamics, though they may never consciously admit it. They are constantly assessing, often unconsciously, where they stand in relation to you. Not in terms of dominance, but in terms of emotional leverage. Who needs who more? Who is more affected? Who is more willing to tolerate inconsistency? If your answer to their distance is increased availability, what you're communicating is simple. I will adjust myself to maintain access to you. And while that may seem like love, what it often translates into on a psychological level is a loss of perceived value. Because value in human behavior is tied to scarcity, to standards, to the presence of something that cannot be easily bent or negotiated away. This is why boundaries are not walls, they are signals. They communicate without aggression that there is a line where your self-respect begins. And when you hold that line consistently without emotional volatility, you introduce something many avoidants are not used to encountering. Stability without submission. Now think about how most interactions go. The avoidant pulls back. The other person feels anxious, confused, maybe even afraid of losing the connection. So they lean in harder, try to fix it, smooth it over, make it easier. But every time that happens, a subtle message is reinforced. There are no consequences to my distance. This dynamic will continue regardless of how I show up. And human beings by nature do not respect what requires nothing of them. So when you begin to set boundaries, real ones, not threats, not ultimatums, but grounded decisions, you interrupt that pattern. You're no longer reacting to their behavior, you're defining your own. You're saying, in effect, this is the level of presence and respect I require to continue investing here. And then more importantly, you follow through. That follow through is where respect is born, because words without action are easily dismissed. But when your behavior aligns with your standards, you become predictable in a very different way, not predictable in your reactions, but predictable in your self-respect. And that kind of consistency is deeply disarming to an avoidant. It forces them to reevaluate, not in a dramatic, confrontational sense, but internally. They begin to recognize that this dynamic is no longer one-sided. That access to you is not automatic. That your presence is something that must be met, not managed. This is something Tony Robbins often speaks to when he talks about the standards we tolerate versus the standards we enforce. Because whatever you consistently accept, you are teaching others how to treat you. Not through what you say, but through what you allow. And here's the deeper layer: boundaries don't push people away who are meant to stay. They reveal who is willing to rise to meet you. An avoidant may initially resist this shift. They may test it, question it, even pull back further for a moment. But what you're doing is introducing a new structure, one where connection is not based on your willingness to accommodate their distance, but on their willingness to meet you in presence. And that's where attraction rooted in respect begins to form. Not because you demanded it, but because you embody it. So the question you have to ask yourself is this: where have I been negotiating my standards in the hope of maintaining connection? And what would change if I stopped negotiating and started deciding? Because the moment you stop trying to earn respect and start living in alignment with it, the entire dynamic reorganizes itself around you. And here's the truth to carry forward: people don't value you more when you give them more, they value you more when they realize you're not available for less. Now let's go a layer deeper into something most people never fully understand in relationships like this. Emotional growth doesn't happen in comfort. It happens in friction. It happens in moments where your patterns are interrupted, where your assumptions are challenged, and where you're forced to see yourself and the other person more clearly than you're used to. And when you're dealing with an avoidant, this becomes even more important. Because avoidants are not lacking in emotion, they are avoiding emotional overwhelm. They've learned, often early in life, that too much emotional intensity can feel unsafe, unpredictable, or consuming. So their strategy is control through distance. They step back, not because they feel nothing, but because feeling too much once came at a cost. So if you enter that dynamic and your only goal is to create comfort, predictability, and emotional ease, what you're actually doing is reinforcing their avoidance. You're building a space where nothing ever challenges their internal structure. And without challenge, there is no reason for adaptation. There is no reason for growth. There is only repetition. But here's the paradox. What actually helps an avoidant evolve emotionally is not more emotional pressure, it's calibrated emotional friction. Not chaos, not volatility, but a grounded presence that does not collapse when they withdraw, does not chase when they distance, and does not abandon itself just to maintain proximity. That kind of presence creates a very specific psychological disruption. It interrupts their expectation that distance will automatically restore control. It introduces a new variable. You remain unchanged in your self-respect even when they shift. And that's where introspection begins. Because now they're not just managing their emotions, they're observing yours. They're noticing that their usual pattern doesn't produce the same result. That something in the dynamic has changed. And when a pattern stops producing predictable outcomes, the mind begins to analyze it. This is the beginning of emotional awareness, not because you forced it, but because you stopped over-accommodating their avoidance. This is where challenge becomes transformative rather than confrontational. You are no longer trying to pull them into emotional depth. You are simply refusing to meet them in emotional absence. And that gap, the space between your presence and their withdrawal, becomes the space where reflection happens. It's important to understand this. Growth is rarely comfortable for the person experiencing it. It requires tension. It requires uncertainty. It requires a moment where old coping mechanisms stop working well enough to remain unconscious. That's what challenge creates when it's done correctly. It doesn't attack the person, it destabilizes the pattern. And in that destabilization, something powerful can emerge. Awareness. This is something Tony Robbins often points to in his work when he talks about change. People don't change when they are comfortable. They change when the cost of staying the same becomes greater than the discomfort of growth. That principle applies directly here. If the avoidant can continue distancing without consequence, there is no internal reason to evolve. But when distance no longer guarantees emotional control or relational stability, something inside them begins to reconsider the pattern itself. Now, this doesn't mean you become distant for manipulation. It means you become anchored. You stop chasing emotional consistency from someone who is currently inconsistent.
You stop
over-functioning in the relationship. You stop trying to smooth every emotional edge just to keep them close. And in doing so, you create a relational environment where growth is possible not because you demanded it, but because you stop preventing its natural emergence. There's a subtle but profound shift here. You are no longer the emotional regulator of the relationship. You are no longer absorbing all the instability just to keep things intact. Instead, you allow space for discomfort to exist without rushing to fix it. And that space is where real change begins. Because without discomfort, there is no awareness. Without awareness, there is no choice. And without choice, there is no growth. So when you challenge an avoidant in this way, what you are really doing is refusing to participate in a dynamic that keeps both people emotionally static. You are introducing the possibility of evolution by no longer reinforcing stagnation. And the truth is this: emotional depth is never created by avoiding discomfort, it's created by learning how to stay grounded inside it. That's where transformation begins. And that's what most people miss entirely. Now let's talk about something that often gets misunderstood, yet plays a massive role in attraction dynamics, mystery, and unpredictability. Because once you understand avoidant psychology, you begin to see a pattern. They are not drawn to what is fully available, fully readable, and fully predictable. Not because they dislike stability, but because predictability removes emotional activation. When everything is known, when every response is expected, when every interaction follows a familiar script, the mind stops engaging. And for an avoidant, disengagement is the default setting when stimulation drops. So when you make yourself emotionally predictable, always available, always responsive, always emotionally consistent in a way that removes tension, you unintentionally lower your psychological impact. You become safe, but also forgettable in the emotional sense. Not because you lack value, but because nothing in the interaction challenges their attention anymore. Now contrast that with something different. A presence that is stable but not predictable, grounded but not fully readable, consistent in self-respect but flexible in emotional expression. That combination creates curiosity. And curiosity is one of the most powerful forces in human psychology because it forces the mind to stay engaged. It creates internal questions. It disrupts autopilot perception. This is where mystery becomes not a performance, but a natural result of emotional independence. When you are overly focused on managing how someone perceives you, you become predictable in a very specific way. Your reactions start orbiting around their behavior. If they withdraw, you pursue. If they return, you soften instantly. If they distance again, you adjust yourself to close the gap. Over time, your emotional responses become easy to map. And once someone can map you, they no longer need to engage deeply with you. They already know what will happen next. But when you begin to challenge that pattern, something shifts. When you don't immediately react, when you don't instantly adjust, when you don't fill every gap with explanation or emotional reassurance, you introduce uncertainty and chaos, but space. And in that space, the avoidant mind begins to engage differently. They start to notice your absence more sharply. They start to question what you're thinking, how you're feeling, what direction you're moving in. That questioning is where emotional re-engagement begins. Because now, instead of you constantly stepping into their emotional rhythm, they are forced to step into yours. And your rhythm is no longer fully predictable. You are not withdrawing to punish. You are not disappearing to manipulate. You are simply no longer overexposing your internal world to someone who has not earned constant access to it. This is where mystery becomes power flat, is not about hiding who you are, but about no longer overgiving your emotional availability in ways that remove tension from the relationship. And tension, when grounded in respect, is not negative. It is what keeps attention alive. This is something Tony Robbins often touches on in his broader teachings about human behavior. People are not driven by logic alone. They are driven by emotional patterns, by contrast, by shifts in state. If nothing changes in how they experience you, their emotional system eventually categorizes you as stable background rather than active presence. So unpredictability in this sense is not about inconsistency in character. It is about refusing to be emotionally overexposed in ways that eliminate curiosity. And here's where avoidants become particularly interesting in this dynamic. Because they are highly attuned to control, they often expect emotional environments to either demand too much or ask too little. When they encounter someone who is neither chasing nor collapsing, they will try to help. Neither over-explaining nor emotionally withdrawing in retaliation, it disrupts their internal model of relationships. They can no longer predict your emotional trajectory, and that unpredictability forces attention back onto you. They begin to observe more. They begin to think more. They begin to re-engage not because you demanded it, but because their own psychological system is trying to recalibrate around something that no longer fits their old expectations. But there is a deeper truth here that most people miss. Mystery is not something you create by acting differently. It is something that emerges when you stop over-functioning in someone else's emotional world. When you are no longer constantly available, constantly explainable, constantly emotionally transparent in every moment, you regain something powerful, presence. And presence is magnetic, because presence says, I am here, but I am not fully accessible on demand. I am open, but I am not an emotional resource to be used without awareness. I am engaged, but I am not predictable in the ways that allow you to disengage from effort. That is what reignites interest. Not games, not manipulation, not distance for its own sake, but the quiet strength of someone who is no longer emotionally overextended just to maintain connection. And in that space, curiosity returns, attention returns, engagement returns. Because people don't stay emotionally invested in what they can fully predict, they stay invested in what continues to make them lean in. And that is the power of mystery when it is grounded in self-respect. In the end, unpredictability is not about confusing someone, it's about finally becoming someone they cannot take for granted. Now let's go into something that sits right at the center of this entire dynamic, the power imbalance. Because whether people realize it or not, every relationship has a power structure. Not in a controlling or manipulative sense, but in terms of emotional positioning. Who is leading the tone of the connection? Who is setting the pace? Who is adjusting themselves more in response to the other? And in avoidant dynamics, this balance often tilts in a very specific direction. The avoidant becomes the one who can step forward or step back at will, while the other person unconsciously adapts to maintain connection. Over time, this creates a silent hierarchy, not one spoken out loud, but one felt in behavior. One person becomes the stabilizer, the emotional maintainer, the one who absorbs inconsistency in exchange for proximity. And here's the hard truth. When that imbalance persists, attraction starts to erode. Not because love disappears, but because respect becomes distorted. One person is leading through withdrawal, the other is leading through over-accommodation. And neither position creates true relational equality. So when we talk about challenging and avoidant, what we are really talking about is the restoration of balance. Because challenge, when done correctly, interrupts automatic authority. It signals that no one in this dynamic has unchecked emotional control anymore. It shifts the frame from I will adjust to keep you close to I will engage with you, but not at the expense of my own position. And that shift is subtle but powerful. Think about how most avoidant dynamics unfold. One person withdraws, the other reacts. The avoidant learns often unconsciously that distance creates pursuit. That silence creates attention. That emotional withdrawal creates increased effort from the other side. Over time, this becomes a form of learned control, even if it was never intentional. But when you begin to challenge that pattern, you interrupt the learning loop. You stop rewarding inconsistency with increased emotional investment. You stop responding to withdrawal with escalation. You stop reinforcing the idea that the relationship can remain stable while one person carries all the emotional momentum. Instead, you introduce equilibrium. And equilibrium is deeply unsettling to someone who has been operating from imbalance, because now their behavior no longer dictates the entire emotional direction of the connection. This is where real psychological recalibration begins. They start to realize that access is no longer automatic. That emotional availability is not infinite. That your presence is not something that expands endlessly to accommodate their distance. And when that realization sets in, something shifts internally. They begin to assess the relationship differently. Not as a system they can passively engage with, but as something that requires mutual participation. This is where respect starts to form.